allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
We start the meeting with our public comment. If there's anybody in the audience wishing to address the county board about any topic, seeing no one rushing to the podium, we'll move on to approval of the county board minutes from April 10th.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Jacob, second by Commissioner Pomeroy to approve the meeting minutes April 10th. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. They are approved. Acknowledgement of the receipt of approved committee meeting minutes. 5.1 is the Land Records Committee from December 1, 2017.
Move to acknowledge 5.1.
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Pomeroy, or Jacob, second by Commissioner Pomeroy to acknowledge approval of the committee minutes from the Land Records. Any discussion? I did ask one question. Has that committee now switched to bi-monthly meetings? Okay, that was a change. Okay, that's fine. All right, any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Approved. Gentlemen, did you want to address the county board about any issue or anything?
Oh, no, we're just here to sit in.
Okay, all right. Well, we're moving at a fast pace, and I didn't want anybody that was 2 minutes late not to have their opportunity. So here's your opportunity. If you got anything you want to talk to us about,
It doesn't have to be on the agenda.
Yeah. No, okay. All right. Thank you for coming. Consent comments and approval of the agenda. Anything to add?
I've got some announcements.
Announcements?
I have one.
Announcement? Okay.
Nothing for me.
Okay. And I also have one. All right. So we have announcements. Other than that, consent business, motion to approve the consent business as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Jacob, second by Commissioner Pomeroy to approve the consent business as recommended or as presented. Any discussion?
Agenda?
He should present it first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Approve the agenda. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm ahead of myself. Okay, a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Taking my job away.
Yeah, I'm taking the job away. Okay, motion made by Commissioner Olson. Did I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Second by Commissioner Pomeroy. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Okay, approve the agenda. Now, if you'd read the consent business, Mr. Fritz, into the record.
I'll read the consent business into the record. Department recommendation 7.1, appoint jail advisory committee member. 7.2, approve monthly resolution. 7.3, approve 2018-2019 radiological emergency preparedness grant. 7.4, approve solid waste hauler and facility licenses renewal applications. 7.5, approve write-off of uncollectible accounts for first quarter 2018. 7.6, approve resolution for donations received from 1/1/2018 to 3/31/2018. And 7.7, confirm payment of disbursements. That concludes the consent agenda.
I move to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion made by Commissioner Pomeroy, second by Commissioner Kavesi to approve the consent department recommendations as presented. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Approved. Just one real quick comment. I think everybody got the memo. We just approved some emergency preparedness grant, and we have a new emergency manager, Ben Klinger. He has been a department or a staff person in the jail, sheriff's office.
Sheriff didn't inform tonight for it, but he's going to make a point to bring Ben over, probably one of the meetings, just to introduce him to everybody. He was the former program coordinator in the jail and was applied and got the position of emergency management.
Great. Okay, I've heard positive comments about that,
Absolutely.
that appointment already. So thank you. Thank you, officer. All right. All those in favor say, did we approve that? All those in favor say aye.
We already did.
Okay, I thought we did. I'm sorry, I don't know. It's too nice of an evening to be sitting inside. Yeah. Okay, moving on. 8.1, receive the Jail Advisory Committee update. And I think we have Mr. Weber with us tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Tom Weber, and I've been working with the Jail Advisory Group for a little bit. I've got just kind of a brief presentation that I kind of wanted to talk to the board about who I am, what we're doing, who's all involved with it, and just give you kind of a briefing on where the project has, because we're 3 months into it now. Our estimated timeline was 9 months, so you'll bear with me. We'll see if we can get through this. I want to tell you how long I was around. That picture there, you can see the bumper of that car you can just barely see. I realized that when I took that picture, that is a 1998 Ford Escort that I drove. So when I took the picture of that courthouse, that's how long I've been around. I started in Winona in 1984 in corrections here with the Department of Corrections. I worked here for about a year, and then I had done contract pre-sentence investigations for a long time while I was working in the state of Wisconsin for the Department of Corrections. But my history with Winona goes way back into the early 80s, and with National Institute of Corrections, I was back starting in around 1998, and I've been here for a number of different projects since then over the last 20 years. So this current project with this jail advisory group is just kind of one more thing that I've been involved with in the county. I think I know the community pretty well. I know a lot of the people that are stakeholders in this justice system and in the community, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So
You're not driving the Escort anymore?
I'm not driving the Escort anymore.
There's a few of them still out there.
So we're going to talk a little bit about who I am and who this group is, what we're doing, and how we're going to do it. So I happen to live in La Crosse. I've got about 30-some years now working in corrections. Again, I've also done a lot of work in court management. Somewhere along the line, I developed an expertise in working with Native American communities. So I do a lot of contract work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Justice Assistance in whole system planning. Because typically in Native American communities, they don't have really any resources. They're usually very rural, and they have no capital and no resources to invest in developing their justice system and their community responses to crime and other social problems. So I'll go into these communities and I'll work with the different levels of tribal government and community stakeholders, and we'll look at developing what we call a full continuum of care and or a circle of care. You've probably heard about wraparound services with kids and juvenile delinquents and things. Those are typically referred to as providing the support and attempts towards intervention and prevention for both adults and juveniles. And in this project, in this needs assessment, what we're doing is we're looking and we're examining both adults and juveniles, and we want to look at this continuum of care or this circle of care, whatever we're going to define this as. And we may define it as a circle of care for kids and a continuum of care for adults. But you know, as this project kind of proceeds, we're going to have a definition on that. The end result is the process is the same. We look at the very least restrictive early prevention programs, what keeps people from committing crimes and or violating social norms, to the most restrictive, which in the case of Winona County and any county, is how do you use a jail and what is the purpose of the jail and what do you need for the jail. The jail is on one end of that continuum, and then prevention is oftentimes on the other. So in our process, we're looking at this full continuum, every element, every resource. We're trying to identify it, look at the population that they serve, how it's being used now, how might it be used in some other manner in the future to help address the needs of what we call specific target populations. Target populations are those that can either stay out of jail, or you can do some things to keep them out of jail, or it's sometimes who do you want to have in jail as a local community. It can go the other way as well. So we're very early into this process. This is all part of kind of the plan, but my role is to facilitate the work of the advisory group. The Jail Advisory Committee is really a group that goes way beyond advisory. They are the workhorses. I'm the facilitator, And so we have organized this process right now. We've got about 4 subcommittees, and there's actually some subcommittees of the subcommittees that have specific tasks already. Ken is working, for instance, with one group that has broken itself down into a couple of different groups on looking at some of the demographic material, as well as developing what we call a community resource directory. A community resource directory is the identification of all those little steps along the way in that continuum of care that I talked about. If we're going to start to identify what populations need to be served and how do we serve that group, one of the things we want to do is not necessarily create a whole lot of new programs and new ways of doing business if they're already there and if they're already existing and can perhaps be expanded and or their mission or role be focused towards addressing some of the social service and or justice system needs. So the Jail Advisory Committee is right now has 4 different work groups. Some of those, again, have been broken down into subcommittees, and I think towards the end I talk a little bit about that under next steps. What are we doing? So I'm under contract to facilitate this process. I come up 1 day a month. It's the last Tuesday of the month. And then there's some preparation time and there's some follow-up time. I average about 10 hours a month that I'm billing for. My hours are actually greater than that, but at this point in time, I'm fine billing for 10 hours. That's what we had agreed to, and that's what I envision trying to stay within every month. The idea when we created this was the county didn't want to spend what is typically in these kinds of projects. They range anywhere from about $40,000 to about $250,000. And how can there be such a big range? Well, as you start to do what we call master planning for your justice system, you start with this needs assessment. The needs assessment is basically what's wrong, what are the gaps, what are the issues, where are there different things that need to be worked on to improve the efficiency or the outcomes. That needs assessment outlines basically all those deficiencies. That's what a need actually is. The comprehensive master plan then takes that needs assessment because this tells you maybe what's wrong. The master plan starts to tell you how can you resolve it. And then what do you need in terms of additional programs, additional facilities. If you get towards that end of a $250,000 program, typically what you've got is architects and engineers involved giving you some concepts, some schematic designs on buildings, things like that. We're not going anywhere near down that road with this group. We're going to talk a little bit about how we're doing this. And this is why this is an important thing. If you're looking at a $250,000 project and a master planning project, you're going all the way through this, including those red items that I've got highlighted there. But the first step in this process is to talk about need, and that's where we're at with this. Okay, now need then drives your vision. How are you going to fix it? In this work project that we've got going, this group is already talking about these things, about how they would envision things working differently in the future. That's part of the vision. Why is vision important? Because vision leads towards the actual creation of policy. Okay? So without vision, you don't know what direction you're heading and you don't start to form policy. What does policy do? Policy actually starts to create operations. Now, operations are defined as procedures and practices and programs. So we're actually, in this process, in this project that we're doing with the advisory committee, we're going up to a little bit of the operations, but we're not really doing operations. But operations are being discussed, policy, programs, procedures. As this advisory committee is essentially a lot of the same members that are from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And so they have the ability, as we are working through some of these things, to start identifying and making changes in their own policies, practices, and procedures as we are working through some of these and identifying some of these needs. So they're not waiting for the project to necessarily end. They can kick in and start making some changes right off the bat. So operations does come into play with this project a little bit. But we're stopping there. We're not talking about designing specific programs. We're not talking about designing jail bed space. We're stopping at this point where this discussion essentially is at operations. If you were to go through that entire process, and your next steps when this needs assessment is done, is you're going to want to look at where do you want to go for next steps. As a county board, you're going to have to determine that. Now, in this needs assessment, there's going to be recommendations for all of these needs. How are you going to meet these needs? How are you going to overcome them? Those action plans, if you will be available for your review, and they're going to be needed to be reviewed because some of them, obviously, are going to talk about new identified programs and or facilities. And so that piece of information will come back to the board. That board will be able to read the report that's created by the advisory committee and is going to come back with this list of recommendations and action plan on what you should look at for next steps as you proceed this entire evaluation. And what you will ultimately do will be you will create your own comprehensive master plan. That's where this kind of leads to. But before you get to that point, you have to get through this needs assessment. So in our timeline, we had estimated we'll get this group together. We're going to, and essentially it was, again, this group from the CJCC. They're coming together once a month just to look at this needs assessment piece. And we're hoping that in late fall, we're going to have this wrapped up. So about 6 months from now, October, November, what our original discussion was, we want to have our final report to the board by December, because we kind of wanted to wrap this thing up in this current year. Now, I can tell you that when I do these kinds of projects, and we dedicate a lot of time to those, typically they take about 6 months, and I'm working about every other week on it. Okay, so they are, and they can be very labor intensive. However, they usually go farther than what we're going in this as well. So when Ken and I were talking about how are we going to frame this and what are we going to look for timelines on it, I said, well, we usually don't work it in this kind of a manner where we've got an advisory committee that's doing a lot of the work and that we're going to be meeting only one time a month. I said, I think we should plan for 9 months because we're only looking at this needs piece. Let's see what we can get done. So I am hopeful that our timeline is going to be met, that we're looking at this December date. That's what we're shooting for. But, you know, don't crucify me if it doesn't happen, because, again, this is the first kind of attempt where this has been a very kind of a low pressure, not a lot of labor on my part coming into this. But I think this is working pretty well so far. I know that as we start to try to gather information and organize it, it's going to require a whole lot of commitment from a number of members from that committee. I know Ken has talked about it, and Karen, and Justin Green, by the way, is the chairperson, and Ken is kind of co-chairing it, either officially or unofficially. But Ken is our point of contact within the county. Justin Green has been appointed kind of the chair. So he opens and runs the meetings. And then also does a lot of the logistics, gets people together, helps get the agenda circulated, the minutes, all of those things. He's kind of, he's been hurting us and keeping us kind of all together and focused on some things. And he's a community member volunteer. So he has been really instrumental in getting to the point where we're at. But as we move through this, I assume there's going to be a lot of demands on the time of a number of those committee members, and I think our schedule will be driven upon their availability and then the amount of work that they get done. Because again, other than Justin, pretty much the rest of the people on this committee are full-time employees with their plates pretty full with their other jobs already. So that's going to be, I think, one of the issues that we're going to have to work through is how are we going to get some of this stuff done, because the product is essentially driven by the availability of the committee members. What is a needs assessment? the first thing is, and I've learned this through my career in corrections, when I first started in corrections back in the 80s, we used to say we wanted to do some things, whether it was the way we supervised offenders that were in the community or the way we detained people in the jail or the way the court sentenced people to jail. We used to say we think this is the right way to do it. And we didn't back it up with any empirical evidence. There was nothing that was known as best practices or evidence-based practices. Those kinds of things are now available. Just as technology has evolved, the world of corrections and court management has evolved as well. But what you have to do to become engaged in best practices or evidence-based practices is you got to be able to defend your decisions and your recommendations. The best way to do that is through an objective collection of data that can be measured. It can be determined for its use in either operations management, or evaluation. And it can be applied and used in making your recommendations and then in defending decisions. So, for instance, when communities come together and they say, we want to create a new mental health diversion program, they have to know that this is going to serve 20 people. It's likely to divert 1,000 jail beds during the course of the year. The cost is going to be 2 staff people at this X number of dollars. The average length of stay in the program is going to be 6 months. The daily cost per individual is going to be $35 a day, whatever it might be. You now have to have all of that information in your arsenal, if you will, so that as community members or taxpayers or anybody else, county board commissioners come up and say, why do you think we need this? We have to be able to provide that data and that information so that you can defend the decisions, which oftentimes come down to, are you going to fund it or not? Okay, so in this whole process, we emphasize a lot of where can we find the data, and where can we make, and data is only numbers for the most part, or terms, or definitions. It doesn't become information until you understand what it means and how you're going to use it, how you're going to apply it, and then what are you going to compare it to? Because there's always some sort of a comparative context as you start to make information out of data. So part of our process is to create this whole data collection plan, which we've currently engaged in. We happen to find a lot of that information when you start to look at your jail population. It tells you who's in jail, why they're in jail, how long they're in jail. It'll tell you their gender, their classification level, their offense type. If they're engaged in certain programs and if there's a good classification system, it'll start telling you what some of their criminogenic factors are. Those are the things that make a person more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Things like substance abuse, drug abuse, poor education, lack of job skills, residential instability, poor medical health. All of these things have impact on either risk or needs, which are these criminogenic factors. Why are criminogenic factors important? Because it tells you what intervention strategies then might you develop and or tap that person into or refer them to help start to combat and counter the impact of those criminogenic factors. That's where your continuum of care and this circle of care comes in. Those resources are those things where you're referring that individual, whether they're an adult or a juvenile offender, into it to try to interrupt and try to intercede in their life so that they're less likely to offend, so that public safety is enhanced, so that the quality of the community life is improved, and all of those things. Now, they all have costs attached to them, and they can either be real money costs or they can be impact to quality of life. Some of the quality of life issues are harder to measure, and we are aware of that. But it's very important to look at those as well as we start to talk about what areas of the community are impacted and what quality of life. And if we can measure it, we try to find some measurable means to it. But this needs assessment takes a look at all of those areas. It starts to also create this communication process for a constant exchange of information. These kinds of reports and these assessments don't do any good at all if the information doesn't get memorialized, shared, supported. And so we have to spend a pretty significant amount of time on what's the message that needs to go out, and then how do you collect that message, and then how do you distribute it to the community? Because the community is actually the centerpiece of this whole project. I do some presentations at different conventions. In fact, this week the American Jail Association is meeting without me in Sacramento. But I have presented there a number of times in my career. And I oftentimes present on justice system issues. Because the justice system is not just the courts, it's not just the sheriff, it's not the prosecutor, it's not any one single element. If you take a look at the way the justice system should operate, I like to compare it to a bicycle wheel. And I say, if you want the justice system, how many times do we hear that the justice system just doesn't work real well, doesn't flow, it doesn't work smoothly? There's all these problems with it. Well, if a bicycle wheel is going to work effectively, it's got to be perfectly round. It's got to have the right amount of air in it. It's got to have good rubber. It's got to have a rim. It's got to have these supportive spokes. It's got to have a center and a hub. That's where the strength is. So if I'm doing a presentation and it happens to be at the judges conference, I'll ask the judges, I'll say, who do you think in that justice system is the most important thing that everything else revolves around? Who's at the center of that wheel of justice? And of course, if it's judges, they're going to say they are. If it's law enforcement, they're going to say, hey, without us, nothing else happens. It's going to be us. The prosecutors are going to say, without us, we can kick these cases out or we can send them along. Prosecutors are going to say, it's them. Well, the fact of the matter is all of those, as well as many other, including defense attorneys and victim witness advocates, mental health, substance abuse counselors, they're all part of that supportive spokes that are there, that are holding up that outside of that wheel. But the community is the hub of that and the center which everything else should revolve around. Too many times in the justice system, the community revolves around the justice system instead of the justice system revolving around the community. And so in this, the way we look at this process is we look at what are the community's strengths, values, and interests. And how does each one of these supportive spokes interact with that? And what is their role in making this justice system in Winona work more smoothly and more effectively? So that's why we look at all of this. The jail is one spoke of this, for instance, okay? They're just one spoke. They're not what everything else revolves around. Although when it comes to money, a lot of people think it is. Because the jail is your most expensive resource in this full continuum of care or circle of care. It's a very expensive resource. That's why it's important to know how you're using your jail beds that you have available or what your needs are for jail beds down the line. So with this, we also take a look at what are some of the general population trends in the community. What's happening in the community? Is it growing? And if it is growing, at what rate? I can tell you this, if you go to certain suburbs of New York City, you have almost zero crime rate and you might have 50,000 people there. But it's also, the minimum house value there is about $7 or $8 million. Okay? They have very low crime rates. They don't have a need for a jail typically in some of those suburbs. If you go to the Bronx, or you go to Queens, or you go to some other part of New York there, you get a completely different picture about what the population looks like that lives in that community and what their potential consumption of jail beds is. So you have to really evaluate what your community is and then what are some things that are coming into the community that might impact the jail population. We call all of that scenario developments in population forecasts. Population forecasts help you define and forecast what your future jail bed needs are. I do expect this group is going to get into that so that they can say, you know, you're going to need 50 maximum male beds or 40 minimum or 20 medium, whatever those numbers are. We're nowhere near close figuring that out, by the way. But that's going to be one of the pieces that's going to help as far as identify what some of your needs are in the future. Because we're going to be able to evaluate how many inmates, for instance, are getting shipped out, because those inmates are the maximum classified, typically male inmates. And we want to know what would that mean in terms of a bed allowance in a Winona County facility. How many beds is that? What's the possible cost on that? We're not in the design, so we're not going to be able to give you that, but I know from my experience, I'll be able to equate a number of square feet per number of inmates, and then typically there's a dollar figure that's attached to it, and I'll be able to give you a fairly broad range on what that cost might mean before you would get to design. But it's going to be a range. It's not going to be anything specific because I'm not an architect. You know, that's the only way that you're going to end up getting a figure for a jail and or any type of a structure is to actually work with an architect at some point. I'm a program planner and analyst, but operations drives design. Go back to that previous slide where I showed you the steps. You know, we're going to be talking about all those things, and we're going to get to this point where you're going to be better prepared to figure out what's your next step. I talked a little bit about forecasting the capacity to meet future demands. That just doesn't mean jail beds. That's going to include things such as court caseloads, defense attorneys, probation, all of those kinds of what I call justice system components. We're going to be able to probably capture some ideas on what's their capacity. We're going to be working with our community partners to also identify what might be the likelihood of maybe developing more community-based services that's going to serve the population coming out of this system. That could be anything. It could be maybe a drug addiction inpatient residential care. It could be detox. It could be a mental health outpatient program. It could be anything that, again, comes into play here in our identification of a needs. Again, those things are going to come along as we work through this process. But we're not going to have a lot of solutions in this. We're going to have identified areas of need with possible course of action for consideration. So that's what we're going to keep focusing on, with the idea that if approved, if everyone agrees these are important priorities for the county to start looking at, then there's going to have to be some next steps that are going to follow up to develop the response mechanisms to these needs that we're uncovering, whatever they may be. They could be programs, they could be facilities. We don't know yet. One big thing that, again, we want to talk about is all of these other issues that we're talking about and these other resources, they kind of tend to get grouped into a couple of different definitions: prevention and intervention, or alternatives to incarceration. In my mind, they all mean kind of the same thing, and sometimes the terms get confusing. But if they're alternatives to incarceration, I may have said revocation, but it's alternatives to incarceration. If they're alternatives to incarceration, you want to be able to substantiate, is this going to save a jail bed day, or is it going to avoid a jail bed day? Jail bed days are one of the big measurable terms that we will be looking at in trying to collect some of the data. Because each unit of a jail bed day is one day. If you have 100 beds, that means every day you can provide 100 units of jail bed days. We want to know how many jail bed days are being consumed here by different groups: male, female, felony, misdemeanor, sentenced, unsentenced, maximum, medium, minimum, mentally ill. You know, the list goes on and on and on. That's the way you get to the breakdown of who's in your jail and who maybe doesn't need to be in your jail. So it starts to identify those target populations. All of those are couched, if you will, in terms of how many jail bed days are they consuming. How many would be available if they weren't in the jail? That's what controls the size of your jail. It's all controlled by two things, and two things only control the size of a jail. How many are coming in? How long do they stay? How many are coming in is what we call bookings or admissions. How long they stay is the average length of stay. If you give me those two specific data elements for any subset population in the jail. I can tell you what the average daily population was for that type of an offender and how many jail bed days they consumed. So in this data collection process, that's where we go. We break all of this stuff down. We measure it in these terms, typically of bookings and length of stay, because those two pieces of data will give us lots of information. It's converting the data to information. And it applies to programs in the community as well. You want to know how many individuals are going to be taking advantage of a program, how many are coming in, how long do they stay. That forecasts what your capacity and need is by program slots. So if you're going to do an intensive supervision program for kids out of juvenile detention, does that mean there's 6 kids on, 8 kids on? How many do we have to plan for that you might be taking out of placement, out of home placements? How many would be an average caseload? Well, that's driven by the design of and the duties that are all going to be involved with on the level of services. So these are some of the things that we are looking at, and again, the identification of what the need is. Not necessarily how they're going to get fixed right now, but what is the need. The fixing part is going to come in the second step after this project's complete. Again, the final report, I think Karen and Ken and Justin have pretty much agreed that they're going to be kind of the authors of it. I'll be doing a lot of guidance on that. We're trying to keep up every month with our report, kind of our minutes and things, talking about how things are going to be framed in a final report. So this is a process that is kind of under construction with us, and I would anticipate again that that is going to be one of the more labor-intensive pieces of this project. So it is going to be, again, in a kind of an additional demand. There's been no staff support essentially provided for that group. So it is going to be those individuals who are volunteering to take this extra task on that are going to be providing this report. So I want everybody to keep that in mind and make sure that that effort is appreciated, because I know how much work it is. So again, the needs assessment begins this process that's going to shape the various scenarios that are the most appropriate and applicable solutions to the long-standing justice system operational needs, and specifically use of juvenile detention and jail beds. And that doesn't mean planning for using them, but it can also, again, the emphasis here is how do you prevent from using them? You know, it's a two-way street, but it all has to be analyzed and based upon how you're using it now. Again, the typical needs assessments, it's going to help you understand how your justice system and social service system currently operates. It'll give you information on what's driving your justice system program needs. For instance, opioid addiction. In many parts of the country, it's huge. It's driving jail populations sky high. Mental illness, driving jail populations sky high. Jails have become the de facto mental health local community residential facilities across the country. I know that the population in this jail is going to be reflecting national trends in many ways, and that's lots of alcohol and drug abuse and lots of mental illness. We find it in every jail everywhere. And then understanding what changes you could perhaps expect in the future by defining what this vision of new programs and facilities are. If we take a look at what we learned from drug court, for instance, when drug courts or other problem-solving courts came out, the idea was if we can get this fairly smaller caseload, provide lots of intensive supervision and lots of justice system interaction with them, we can maybe pull 4 or 6 people out of the jail with that. That means 4 or less beds needed every day on average with this type of a program running. But that's current need. We also know that the success rate with those individuals is much higher with those higher levels and intensity of services than it is with those who don't get it. So the recidivism rate is typically much better for individuals involved in drug court or problem-solving courts than it is for those individuals who aren't involved with it. So you start to realize that We can pull 4 or 6 people out at a time, but maybe 75 out of those 4 or 6, maybe 3 to 5 are going to be winding up in jail in any other occasion. In this particular case, maybe only 2 wind up back in jail because we're having more impact on that behavior. So you start to determine what kind of impact and what's the benefit of doing these things. What can we look at in short-term impact and in likely or probable longer-term impact as far as having some sort of an appreciable impact on recidivism. Recidivism is defined different in every community, but essentially it's how often they return to jail and or juvenile detention. We want to produce, again, ideas. That's what a concept is. Produce program and facility ideas. So in these action plans for the needs assessment part, it's going to be what are some of the concepts that need to be explored. Concepts are the ideas that lead towards policy, programs, and procedures. And this group is tasked with coming up with these concepts. Want to roadmap some of the future pathways for how the justice system is going to operate. This group will be getting into discussions on how things currently operate, how they might operate better in the future. Want to create a foundation to achieve these agreed upon goals. When this group comes together and they become the work group, they now start to develop these processes internally, maybe without even realizing it, on how they can effectively become change agents, how they can be part of this process of program, policy, and procedural development. So the role of the advisory committee is to provide ongoing leadership, and I can't emphasize that enough. They actually have to get out there and get engaged in this, and to their credit, they're all active leaders, and they're volunteering for this program and this project proves a lot of that. They, of course, have to define this shared vision with the community in regard to the justice system. They help define the mission and philosophy of not only justice system programs, but social services. These things come hand in glove, especially with juveniles. Juveniles are typically falling underneath the umbrella of human services or social services everywhere anyway, and all of these things need to be interlinked. And they're, again, for the most part, they're county-provided services. So coordinating those across both adult and juvenile arenas, and then looking at social services and justice system, it's how can this entire community come together, make this wheel of justice work better in this community of Winona. Share the knowledge and awareness of cultural, social, and community issues. Participate in activities to create and share information. I think I've talked about that quite a bit. Review the assessment findings and analyze the implications for planning, providing constant feedback. We all hear about these things where there's unintended consequences. This group really has to look at, okay, if we're going to do this, what are some of the desired consequences and what are some of the unintended consequences that might fall in here? So we want to examine all of that and look at all of the contingencies. Participate in the development of the report to address identified needs, and then champion the effort. That's the role of this advisory committee. How's this going to get done? I mentioned we have our leadership kind of in place. Justin is the chair. Ken has really been providing a lot of the staff support, if you will. He's been doing a bang-up job doing a lot of the minutes recording and working kind of hand in glove with Justin and I and trying to plan for each month's meeting, making sure that all the logistics are taken care of for getting that group together. And then again, he's chairing the demographic and resource directory subcommittee as well. So right now we have 4 subcommittees that have different projects and tasks. As I mentioned, the community profiles, general census trends, and developing this resource directory. That's one and that Ken is chairing. Target populations in jail and out of jail. Justin happens to be chairing that as well. The jail data collection, that's pretty much Steve Buswell, and he has a sergeant that has been assigned to the subcommittee to help develop all of the jail data. And again, that's going to be really critical in us to identify who's coming into jail, how those jail beds are being used, and how can we maybe prevent some of that from happening. And then community information sharing and outreach, that's Karen's group. They're also the report writers, and she is chairing that. And we've also determined, and of course, as I mentioned, some of these subcommittees have created subcommittees within their own subcommittee to kind of carry out these works, with that community outreach being one of them in particular. So this is the way we're envisioning this working. We're kind of on this desired end to, by the end of this year, we want to have a report to you. That's what our goal is. I think there's some concern in the recent exchange of emails that everybody had is this could really be a much bigger and longer project. It can be, but my job is to kind of keep it narrow, keep it focused, keep us on task, and we're taking this one step at a time. There are lots of challenges here, but there's no barriers. So if we continue to look at this as how can we break these big challenges into smaller tasks that we can overcome, we're chipping away at it, and it's a process, but it'll work. I'm fairly comfortable. I've done lots of these around the country, lots and lots of these, and this is a different way for me to do business, and so I'm learning some things as well as to how we're trying to get this process to be successful. So, but it is, it's a work in progress, but I'm very optimistic and very confident that it's going to result in a pretty good product by the time we're done. So with that, if there's anybody has any questions.
Questions of the group?
Thank you.
I've got a couple, if nobody else does. So 87 counties, 86 have jails, and we're all controlled or under the umbrella of Department of Corrections?
Well, not necessarily. You have regulations that you have to follow.
And we all have to follow the same regulations and protocols and...
The minimum standards. You have to follow the minimum standards, correct.
Okay. So with all your research, and you just said you've done a lot of these, is there a book of best management practices? I mean, I don't know, you talked about the wheel. Are we reinventing the wheel? Or can't we pick and choose from other studies you've done and other things that the Department of Corrections has determined? You know, and you mentioned evidence-based, science-based, programs and data. So again, are we reinventing the wheel, or are we inventing our own wheel? Or
What you're doing is, again, you're identifying what's available in the community, in whatever and wherever that element might lie. For instance, it might be within the bureaucratic organization of Winona County government, but it might also be in some other element of the community, such as the hospital, the university, nonprofit organizations, ministerial associations, which oftentimes can provide lots of different services from different churches within that association. This process is all about identifying what you have available. This is what this resource directory is all about. And then trying to figure out how do those impact the offender individually in those criminogenic areas that I'd mentioned. So the idea is, are we reinventing the process? No. Now, if you're looking at, are there standards that are out there that are the gold bar? There are in a number of different things. For instance, when you're talking about adult offender-based practices, National Institute of Corrections has this entire library of evidence-based practices, whether that's for addressing substance abuse, criminal thinking, cognitive intervention, motivational therapy. All of those different elements all come in, and what we try to do is say, is there a need here in Winona? Is it being provided already? Who's it being provided to? How does that fit our target population that we might be able to pull out of the jail? So right now it's an assessment of what's available. That's what this needs assessment is doing. What is the needs of the target population, and then what's available in the resources. If you look at jails, American Jail Association and the American Correctional Association, they have all kinds of standards that are much higher than the state level standards for both programs and facility design for jails. So in some communities, they're determined that they're going to follow the ACA standards if they're going to build a jail. If they are, it means they're going to have more staff. That means they're going to have more components to the facility. The cost is going to be higher. But the trade-off on it is this. If you are an ACA certified jail facility, you have demonstrated that your risk and liability concerns for health and safety are being covered. Jails are all about managing risk, and it's life, safety, and health. If you jeopardize life, safety, or health, you better have a big checkbook, because that's where you're going to get into trouble with lawsuits. And that's why there are definitely different organizations out there that have set standards, and that if you are in compliance with those standards, you reduce your risk for life, safety, and health in running jails. The same is true with lots of different programs, but they call them different things. So in a perfect world, you shoot for that gold bar. Okay, when this group comes together and they start talking about how you're going to action plan for some of these needs assessment, they're going to look at what's the gold bar, and then what would that mean, and then is that something that's really critical and necessary here, or are there other types of interventions and other types of programs and or facilities that might be considered that are going to cover you and reduce your risk, whatever that area is, and meet the objectives and goals of improving public safety, but maybe don't hit that gold bar. So there's, intensity and frequency of services. It's going to be attached to staff and investment. And those are decisions that the Board of Commissioners will have to make at some point. The work of this group is to identify what those are and give it back to you.
And you mentioned a comprehensive master plan. Does anybody other than the county board have to, how does Department of Corrections or anybody else weigh in on this comprehensive master plan?
Well, if you did a comprehensive master plan, so you take it to this next step where, for instance, you started to, if you were looking at a facility and development of a facility, you would engage the services of architects and engineers and a number of other professionals that help you get some ideas on what this facility might look like. All of that stuff has to go to the Department of Corrections then for review for a couple of different things: code compliance, staffing analysis, all of those kinds of things. That would be part of a comprehensive master plan if you wanted facilities to be addressed. So it's a possible next step, or maybe it's step 2 or 3 down the road for you, but it's not the step that this group is currently doing.
Okay. And I know, one more, Commissioner Jacob, you used, I like that term, but I don't know for sure if I understand what it means. Criminogenic factors? Mm-hmm. Have I got that right?
Yes. The criminogenic factors are those things that some people call them risk factors. Uh-huh. Okay. But when they're present in terms of risk and needs, it makes an individual more likely to be engaged in criminal offending. So evidence-based practice targets those criminogenic factors and tries to put up countermeasures. What can you do to offset the damage and the impact of criminogenic factors so that a person becomes less likely to offend? That's what evidence-based practices and best practices, intervention and prevention programs, focus on those kinds of criminogenic factors.
So can you test for criminogenic factors?
You can.
Like in kids? I mean, I don't know.
Well, there is some science that's out there to look at the level of service that's provided for both adults and juveniles. They do this in Winona County already. For instance, with adults, for many years they've engaged in LSI and LSCMIs and lots of different assessments that measure the likelihood of recidivism. Because the more criminogenic factors that are there, the more likely you are that you're going to reoffend. And so a number of these things are represented in screening instruments and in assessment tools that are used for both adults and juveniles. That is also the same type of instrument that targets the individuals for specific programs. And Winona has a fairly well-developed number of tools to look at screening and assessment of individuals already in place.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jacob had some questions.
Yeah, so one question that I've had difficulty finding an answer to, I'm not sure if you could find an answer to it. We've been downgraded from a year lockup to a 90-day facility. How do we know how long we can operate at the 90-day facility status?
Until the department's patience runs out. And if you were to have some kind of an event in the jail, it's going to probably eliminate the possibility of continue to operate underneath that. So if you have an attack on a staff person, if you have an inmate-to-inmate assault, those are the two most likely scenarios that I would see where the Department of Corrections might say we're shutting you down.
Okay, and then the other question I had is, I'm hoping that it was somewhat implied in some of what you covered, but I haven't heard you talk very much about our interrelation between neighboring counties that were helping us facilitate our needs at this point.
As far as housing inmates,
How that might play into the recipe in the future.
yeah, it needs to be one of the elements that's evaluated. There's no question that right now the use of the jails in neighboring counties, that's one of the resources that you have. So right now that fits in your continuum of care. You have 3 jails basically, or maybe 4, because you can use Wabasha, Houston, you might even use Red Wing and or somewhere else if you have to in a pinch. So we want to take a look at all of those jail resources, identify not only the one that's in Winona, but all of these other ones, and look at areas of what are some of the identifiable and objective data things that we want to look at in what we call housing out of county. So it's essentially shipping your inmates out of county for holding. One of the concerns that I have in your current jail is the population that leaves this jail and is being held out of county are your maximum inmates. You don't have, when you're moving inmates outside of the secure envelope of a jail, every time that you have to move one of those inmates, you open up a lot of risk. And that risk translates to public safety issues. The less movement that you have when an individual is in custody status, the safer things are. By definition, the inmates that you are transferring out of county are your most dangerous individuals. They're your maximum because you can't hold them here. And personally, from a corrections professional, that's a risky population to keep moving around without expecting some incident to happen. So we look at, that's one of the things that needs to be evaluated is who's being moved out of county and what are the factors and what are the risks to life, safety, and health. If you're going to get sued, it's going to be because of one of those 3 reasons. And again, managing that population is very critical to managing risk for you. You are the owners and operators of that jail. It'll be Winona, if you get into a lawsuit, the sheriff's name is going to be on there, but it's going to be the county. You know, the sheriff operates with whatever tools and resources is provided by the county. So it's very important for us to look at some of these higher priority areas. This is part of the needs that we really have to explore.
And so I heard you talk about the risk, the liability, and the safety. I assume you're going to look at the potential benefits as well.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's pros and cons to everything that you look at. And again, the whole idea is we want to identify what are those objective measurements.
Some of these inmates are relatively long stay. I mean, if they're a day or 2 or 3 or 5 days, we don't want to be moving those back and forth. But if they're pushing that year-long lockup, yeah, it's risky, but it's one time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know where the liability goes. Does it go to the other jail, or is it still our liability? Or
Well, it's interesting because we kind of had that conversation today. It's open to discussion and debate, and it's usually outlined in contract language. So one of the things we're going to want to look at some point is that whole contract language as well.
Okay.
Commissioner Kavesi.
Yeah, I just had some questions following up Commissioner Ward. When you're talking about the criminogenic factors and how you can lessen the impact of those, would you consider the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, to be one of those identifying factors? Not that it predicts your behavior, but it could have, those adverse childhood experiences, we know by research, can have an effect on your later behavior.
Sure, there's any number of different
Right.
things
Plus
that
the
affect
ones
it.
you mentioned,
Yes.
you know, job skills, all of that.
Trauma. There's lots of different things that factor into that, correct?
Yeah, and some of them are not directly measurable.
That's
Because
correct.
Obviously, children can have the same adverse experiences or similar ones and grow up to be entirely different individuals. So it's not a predictor of behavior.
Right.
Anything from anybody else? All right, well, thank you for giving
Well,
us an update.
Certainly, and again, we look forward to kind of working through this. If you want an update before we get towards the report, we're happy to provide that as well. And otherwise, what I'm assuming is as we near completion of this, we'll probably have different representatives from the advisory committee as well as myself come in and offer a briefing and give you some kind of a background on this whole process and then the resulting report that'll come from it.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kavesi, you had an announcement or communications.
Yeah, two of these are happening right Saturday and Monday, so it's kind of timely. Saturday is the prescription drug take-back day at Walgreens. This is being sponsored by the ASAP, the Alliance for Substance Abuse Prevention, and also the Police and County Sheriff's Department. And it'll be from 10 to 2. So, and then Monday at Lewiston Altura High School from 6:30 to 8, there's going to be a panel discussion and a community discussion. It's called Change the Outcome. It has to do with the opioid, some would say epidemic or whatever, opioid use and addiction, to kind of start to talk about that in our community. And on May 24th, there's training at the History Center on intercultural development, learning to work across differences, and resilience in leadership. So there's 2 workshops. There are CEUs for the workshops if anybody needs those. So that's a little bit further down the line. But just good to know those are resources that we have.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Pomeroy.
Oh, thank you. A public and personal announcement. I think some of us are aware that filings for candidates for elective offices open on May 30th, and that would be for city, county commissioners, and as well as other elected offices. And they'll be open starting May 20th for 2 weeks. And I'm currently serving the last year of the term that I was elected for. And I've given a long, thoughtful consideration, and I've decided that I'm not going to run for re-election to the board. It's been a privilege to serve on the board, and certainly will be until the end of the year as well. But it's going to be time for me to move on and create opportunities for people that want to bring new blood and serve the public. So, very good.
Okay, thank you. Just a public health announcement is that we have had measles in Winona, the city of Winona. In fact, the person who was found to have measles visited our McDonald's just across the street on April 13th. So it was some time ago. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that, if they didn't have a childhood immunization, and that was under the MMR types of things. But if for any reason somebody feels like they're, getting a high fever or rash or any unusual symptoms, they should consult their local doctor. Because measles as an adult can be very devastating.
Yep.
It's bad enough when you're a kid. But take heed that measles have made their presence in Minnesota. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Olson, second by Commissioner Pomeroy to adjourn. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. We are adjourned. Thank you.